March 24, 1945. 1,420 hours. 25,000 feet above Berlin. The formation of B-17 flying fortresses had been under continuous attack for 17 minutes when the German pilots noticed something that made them laugh over their radio frequencies. The American escort fighters approaching from the southwest had their tails painted bright red, a marking so conspicuous it seemed like suicide in air combat. Luftwaffe ace Hauptmann Wilhelm Schneider transmitted to his squadron, "The Americans send us colored boys with Christmas decorations. This will be easy hunting." What followed in the next 43 minutes would shatter every assumption the Luftwaffe had made about race, combat capability, and American resolve. The men flying those red-tailed P-51 Mustangs were about to demonstrate that courage has no color, and that underestimating your enemy based on prejudice is a fatal mistake at 400 miles per hour. The Tuskegee Airmen had been fighting 2 wars since their first combat deployment in June 1943. The first was against the Axis powers. The second was against the assumption that black Americans lacked the intelligence, courage, and discipline required for aerial combat. By March 1945, they had been proving their doubters wrong for nearly 2 years, but the skepticism persisted, not just at home, but in the skies over Europe. The 332nd Fighter Group, consisting of the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons, had adopted their distinctive red tail markings in January 1945. The decision came from Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the group's commanding officer and the first black graduate of West Point in the 20th century. According to declassified Army Air Forces records, Davis wanted his pilots to be unmistakable in the air. "Let every bomber crew know exactly who is protecting them," he wrote in his operational directive dated January 12, 1945. The German response was predictable. Luftwaffe intelligence reports captured after the war reveal that German pilots initially viewed the red-tailed fighters with contempt. A March 1945 intelligence assessment from Jägerschwader 7 stated, "Negro pilots lack the mental capacity for high-speed decision-making required in air combat. Their bright markings suggest American desperation rather than capability." This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was desperately defending German airspace against round-the-clock Allied bombing. The introduction of the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter in late 1944 had given German pilots a technological edge. The revolutionary aircraft could reach speeds of 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied propeller-driven fighter. Luftwaffe commanders believed these jets, combined with what they perceived as inferior opposition from the Tuskegee Airmen, would turn the tide in the air war. The mission of March 24, 1945, was the longest bomber escort mission of the war, a 1,600-mile round trip from Ramitelli, Italy, to Berlin and back. The target was the Daimler-Benz tank assembly plant in the German capital. 15th Air Force records show that 673 B-17 and B-24 bombers would participate, escorted by P-51 Mustangs from multiple fighter groups, including the entire complement of the 332nd Fighter Group, 64 red-tailed aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Williams, leading the 100th Fighter Squadron that day, received the mission briefing at 0600 hours. According to his personal diary, later donated to the Smithsonian, the briefing officer warned, "Intelligence indicates heavy jet fighter presence. The Luftwaffe is throwing everything they have at Berlin-bound raids. Expect Me-262s in force." The Tuskegee pilots knew what this meant. The Me-262 was the most dangerous aircraft in the sky. Traditional dogfighting tactics were useless against an enemy that could accelerate away from any pursuit and attack from angles impossible for propeller aircraft. But the red-tailed pilots had developed something the Luftwaffe hadn't anticipated: tactics specifically designed to counter jet fighters, and the discipline to execute them under fire. As the formations assembled over Italy that morning, no one, neither the bomber crews they would protect nor the German pilots who would attack them, fully understood what the next 6 hours would prove about courage, skill, and the deadly cost of underestimation. The Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, Swallow, represented everything the Luftwaffe hoped would reverse their fortunes in the air war. First operational in July 1944, the twin-engine jet fighter carried four 30 mm Malawian Quachas 108 cannons capable of destroying a B-17 with just a few hits. According to German aviation records preserved in the Bundesarchiv, the aircraft could climb to 30,000 feet in under 7 minutes and execute attack runs that conventional fighters couldn't match. Luftwaffe pilots who flew the Me-262 described it as entering a new dimension of aerial combat. Lieutenant Franz Koster, who survived the war and provided testimony to Air Force historians in 1953, explained, "We could choose our moment, accelerate to attack speed, destroy the target, and escape before enemy fighters could react. Against the heavy bombers, we were nearly invincible." But the Me-262 had vulnerabilities that Luftwaffe commanders either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. The Jumo 004 engines were temperamental, requiring careful throttle management and suffering from limited operational life, often less than 25 hours before requiring replacement. More critically, the aircraft was vulnerable during takeoff and landing when its speed advantage disappeared. And in turning combat, the jet bled energy rapidly, making sustained dogfights dangerous. The Tuskegee Airmen had studied these weaknesses extensively. Intelligence reports from captured German pilots, compiled by the 332nd Fighter Group's intelligence officer Captain Jerome Thompson, had identified the tactical patterns Me-262 pilots typically employed. According to declassified 15th Air Force documents, the red-tailed squadrons had practiced counter-tactics for 3 months before the Berlin mission. The tactics were built on 3 principles. First, never chase a jet in a stern pursuit, the speed differential made it impossible. Second, anticipate the attack angle and position fighters to intercept the jet's approach rather than its departure. Third, protect each other through disciplined formation flying that the Germans called Fluid 4 tactics, adapted from Luftwaffe techniques captured and studied by American intelligence. Lieutenant Edward Harrison, flying as element leader in the 301st Fighter Squadron on March 24, later described the tactical approach in his combat report: "We position ourselves between the bomber stream and the most likely attack vectors. When the jets committed to their attack runs, they had to come through us first. That's when they were vulnerable, locked into their approach, speed building but not yet at maximum, unable to maneuver aggressively without disrupting their attack." The Tuskegee pilots also possessed something that couldn't be quantified in tactical manuals: absolute commitment to the bomber crews they protected. Unlike some escort fighter groups that occasionally abandon their charges to chase individual kills and improve their personal scores, the 332nd Fighter Group maintained strict formation discipline. Their mission was protection, not glory. This philosophy had earned them an extraordinary reputation among bomber crews. By March 1945, B-17 and B-24 crews specifically requested red-tail escorts when possible. A February 1945 survey of bomber crews, documented in 15th Air Force records, showed that 93% of crews who had flown with Tuskegee escorts rated them as excellent compared to 76% for other fighter groups. The German pilots preparing to intercept the Berlin raid on March 24 knew nothing of this reputation. They saw only the bright red tails and assumed easy victories. Hauptmann Schneider's squadron of Me-262s, stationed at Brandenburg-Brest airfield, had shot down 17 Allied aircraft in the previous 2 weeks. His pilots were confident, experienced, and equipped with the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. They were about to learn that technology without respect for your opponent's capability is just expensive machinery waiting to fall from the sky. The bomber stream crossed into German airspace at 1,347 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, leading the 100th Fighter Squadron at 27,000 feet, scanned the sky with the practiced intensity that had kept him alive through 68 previous combat missions. The formation of 64 red-tailed Mustangs flew in a protective pattern around the bombers, high cover, level cover, and low cover positions, each element ready to respond to threats from any altitude. At 1,402 hours, the radio crackled with the call every escort pilot dreaded: bandits, bandits. Jets at 2 o'clock high, diving on the lead box. Captain Leonard Hamilton, flying high cover with the 99th Fighter Squadron, spotted them first, 6 Me-262s in a line-astern formation, diving at a steep angle toward the lead B-17 formation. Their speed was devastating. In seconds, they would be in firing range. According to Hamilton's after-action report filed on March 25, they came down like silver bullets, faster than anything I'd ever seen. But they were committed to their dive, exactly where Captain Thompson's briefing said they'd be. What happened next demonstrated the difference between technological advantage and tactical superiority. Hamilton's element of 4 P-51s had positioned themselves 2,000 feet above and ahead of the bomber stream, specifically to intercept high-altitude jet attacks. As the Me-262s committed to their dive, Hamilton rolled his Mustang into a near-vertical descent, not chasing the jets but intercepting their attack vector. His wingman, Lieutenant Charles Foster, and the second element led by Lieutenant Raymond Green followed in perfect formation. The physics of the interception were brutal and precise. The Me-262s were accelerating through 500 miles per hour, but they were also committed to their attack angle. Hamilton's P-51, diving at full throttle, reached nearly 450 miles per hour, not fast enough to catch the jets, but fast enough to position himself in their path. At 1,403 hours and 40 seconds, Hamilton opened fire at extreme range, 800 yards, not expecting to hit the jets but forcing them to react. The lead Me-262 broke left to avoid the tracers. His wingman followed. The perfectly coordinated attack dissolved into individual evasive maneuvers. The speed advantage that made the jets deadly also made them difficult to control in sudden maneuvers at high speed. The third Me-262 in the formation, flown by Oberfeldwebel Kurt Wagner according to Luftwaffe records recovered after the war, attempted to continue his attack run. He triggered his 30mm cannons at 600 yards from the lead B-17. The shells passed harmlessly beneath the bomber's wing. Then Lieutenant Foster's P-51 intersected Wagner's flight path. Foster had anticipated the jet's trajectory with geometric precision. At 1,404 hours, from 400 yards dead astern, a firing position that should have been impossible to achieve against a jet, Foster triggered a 3-second burst from his 6.50 caliber machine guns. 72 rounds, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, converged on the Me-262's right engine. The Jumo 004 turbine, already operating at its thermal limits, catastrophically disintegrated. Shrapnel from the engine explosion severed the jet's hydraulic lines and punctured the fuselage. Wagner attempted to maintain control, but at 480 miles per hour with one engine gone and his flight controls compromised, the physics were unforgiving. At 1,404 hours and 17 seconds, he ejected. His Me-262, the first jet fighter destroyed by the Tuskegee Airmen, tumbled through 25,000 feet before impacting in a forest near Potsdam. The remaining 5 Me-262s broke off their attack. Not a single bomber had been touched. The mockery was about to become a massacre. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The German response to losing their first jet was immediate and furious. At 1,409 hours, radar stations at Tempelhof reported 12 additional Me-262s scrambling from 3 different airfields around Berlin. Luftwaffe ground controllers, monitoring American radio frequencies, heard the Tuskegee pilots' comm communications and misinterpreted their discipline as inexperience. According to intercepted German radio transcripts declassified in 1973, the ground controller transmitted, "Negro Squadron engaged Northeast Sector. All units exploit weakness. Priority targets." It was the last time that day German commanders would use the word weakness in reference to the red-tailed fighters. Lieutenant Andrew Patterson, leading the 302nd Fighter Squadron's lower cover element, spotted the second wave at 1,411 hours. 8 Me-262s approaching from the southeast at 22,000 feet, below the bomber formation, a classic tactic designed to attack the vulnerable belly of the B-17s where defensive fire was weakest. Patterson's four-ship element was positioned exactly where Colonel Davis's tactical plan had placed them, between the bombers and the most likely low-altitude attack vector. Patterson didn't wait for the jets to commit. At 1,412 hours, he led his element into a diving turn that positioned them head-on to the approaching Me-262s. This was the tactic that terrified most Allied pilots. Closing at a combined speed exceeding 900 miles per hour gave both sides less than 2 seconds to fire and evade. But Patterson had calculated that the German pilots, confident in their technological superiority, wouldn't expect such aggressive tactics from pilots they'd already dismissed as inferior. He was right. The lead Me-262, flown by Hauptmann Ernst Baller according to Luftwaffe loss records, opened fire at 1,200 yards, far too early for accurate shooting but consistent with a pilot who expected his opponents to break away. Patterson held his course. His wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Reed, and the second element stayed in perfect formation. At 800 yards, Patterson triggered his guns. 6 streams of .50 caliber tracers converged ahead of the German jet. Baller broke left, hard. At 520 miles per hour, the Me-262's roll rate was sluggish compared to the nimble P-51. Patterson adjusted his aim with a slight rudder input, a maneuver practiced 10,000 times in training, and walked his fire across the jet's left wing route. The 30mm ammunition stored there detonated. The explosion was visible from the bomber formation 5 miles away. Baller's Me-262 disintegrated at 1,412 hours and 34 seconds. There was no parachute. The remaining 7 jets scattered. 3 attempted to flee using their speed advantage, accelerating away from the fight. 4 reversed course to engage the P-51s in turning combat, a fatal mistake that revealed the inadequate training of replacement Luftwaffe pilots in early 1945. The Me-262 lost energy rapidly in sustained turns, and once slow, it became vulnerable to the Mustang's superior maneuverability. Lieutenant Reed locked onto a jet attempting a climbing turn. The German pilot, whose name was never identified from recovered records, pulled his Me-262 into a spiral climb, trying to use his superior power-to-weight ratio to escape. But Reed had altitude advantage and dove after him, building speed. At the top of the Germans' climb, as the jet's airspeed bled below 300 miles per hour, Reed closed to 250 yards and fired a sustained burst. It sparkled across the Me-262's fuselage and cockpit. The jet rolled inverted and entered a flat spin. It impacted northeast of Berlin at 1,414 hours. Within 6 minutes of the second wave's attack, 3 Me-262s were destroyed, 2 were damaged and fleeing, and the remaining 3 had broken off without firing a shot at the bombers. The red-tailed Mustangs maintained their protective formation. Not one bomber had been lost. By 1425 hours, the psychological transformation was complete. The German pilots who had mocked the red-tailed fighters 30 minutes earlier were now avoiding them. Intercepted Luftwaffe radio communications, recorded by Allied intelligence units and preserved in National Archives files, document the shift. At 1,426 hours, a German flight leader transmitted, Achtung, Rot Schwanz. Die Schwarzstaffel, beware the red tails. The Black Squadron fights like demons. The battle had evolved into something unprecedented in the air war over Germany. Typically, bomber escort missions were defensive operations, fighters protecting bombers from attackers. But the Tuskegee Airmen's tactical execution had been so effective that they had transformed the engagement into an offensive operation. The Luftwaffe was no longer hunting, they were being hunted. Captain Walter Downs, leading a 4-ship element from the 100th Fighter Squadron, spotted a flight of 3 Me-262s attempting to position themselves for an attack run from the north. The jets were maintaining distance, circling warily at 30,000 feet, clearly hesitant to commit after witnessing the destruction of their comrades. According to Downs's combat report, filed with the 332nd Fighter Group headquarters on March 25, he recognized the German pilots' uncertainty and exploited it. "They were waiting for us to make a mistake," Downes wrote. "Looking for a gap in our coverage, a moment when the bombers would be exposed. But we'd trained for this exact scenario. I took my element high and fast, forcing them to react." The tactical maneuver Downes executed was called trading altitude for position, climbing above the jets and forcing them to choose between abandoning their attack or accepting disadvantageous combat. The three Me-262s chose to attack. It was their last mistake. As the jets committed to their dive, Downes's element rolled inverted and descended in a precisely calculated intercept. The timing had to be perfect. Too early and the jets would adjust their angle, too late and they'd reach the bombers. At 1,428 hours, Downes achieved the ideal position, above and behind the lead jet, with enough speed to track him through his attack run. The German pilot, Lieutenant Hans Richter, according to records from the Bundesarchiv, must have known he was in a fatal position. His jet was accelerating through 480 miles per hour, but he was locked into his attack trajectory. Breaking off would mean abandoning the mission. Continuing meant certain death. He continued. Downes opened fire at 500 yards. His first burst struck the Me-262's left engine nacelle. The second burst, 3 seconds later from 350 yards, destroyed the cockpit canopy and killed Richter instantly. The jet, now pilotless but still screaming forward at nearly 500 miles per hour, passed within 200 feet of AB-17 before rolling left and plunging toward Earth. It crashed into the Spree River at 1,429 hours. The two remaining Me-262s in Richter's formation immediately broke off their attack. One fled east at maximum speed. The other attempted to engage Downes's wingman, Lieutenant Carl Brewster, in a turning fight, the same fatal mistake others had made. Brewster, whose pre-war experience as a civilian aerobatic pilot had made him one of the most skilled maneuvering fighters in the squadron, allowed the jet to commit to the turn, then tightened his own turn inside the German's radius. The physics were unforgiving. The Me-262, designed for high-speed interception, lost energy catastrophically in sustained turns. Within 30 seconds, the jet had bled speed from 420 miles per hour to 280 miles per hour. Brewster's P-51, lighter and more maneuverable, closed from 800 yards to 200 yards. At 1,430 hours, Brewster fired a 4-second burst that destroyed the Me-262's right engine and severed its tail control surfaces. The pilot ejected successfully, but his parachute deployed directly into the path of falling debris from his disintegrating aircraft. He died before reaching the ground. The massacre was methodical, professional, and absolutely devastating to Luftwaffe morale. The bombing run over Berlin lasted 11 minutes. From 1437 to 1448 hours, 673 heavy bombers dropped their ordnance on the Daimler-Benz tank assembly plant. The factory, which had been producing 35 Panther tanks per week, would never build another combat vehicle. But the strategic success of the bombing mission was almost secondary to what the Tuskegee Airmen had achieved in the air battle surrounding it. By 1450 hours, as the bomber stream turned southwest for the long flight back to Italy, German fighters had ceased all attacks. Luftwaffe records from March 24, compiled from surviving squadron reports, document that ground controllers ordered a general withdrawal at 1,446 hours. The order, preserved in Bundesarchiv files, reads simply, "All units disengage. Red Tail fighters have air superiority. Preserve aircraft for future operations." It was an extraordinary admission. The Luftwaffe, defending their own capital city, had conceded the sky to pilots they had mocked just hours earlier. The flight back to Ramitelli took 4 hours and 12 minutes. As the red-tailed Mustangs crossed back into friendly airspace over Yugoslavia at 1,702 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Williams conducted a radio check of all aircraft. The response confirmed what the mission leader already suspected: every bomber under their protection had survived. Every single one. Out of 673 heavy bombers that had flown into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, none had been lost while under escort by the 332nd Fighter Group. The Tuskegee Airmen landed at Ramitelli between 1847 and 1921 hours. Ground crews counted the returning aircraft with mounting excitement. 62 P-51s returned safely. 2 had been forced to land at emergency fields due to mechanical issues unrelated to combat. Not a single pilot had been lost. The aircraft told the story of the day's combat. Armorer crews counted empty shell casings from the .50 caliber machine guns. The 62 returning Mustangs had collectively fired 284,000 rounds, an average of 4,580 rounds per aircraft. Several planes showed battle damage from German anti-aircraft fire, but none from air-to-air combat. The Me-262s had never gotten close enough to land hits on their tormentors. Intelligence Officer Captain Thompson began the debriefing at 1945 hours. As pilot after pilot reported their engagements, the scope of the victory became clear. The preliminary count, documented in the 332nd Fighter Group's daily operations report dated March 24, 1945, showed 12 confirmed Me-262 kills, 4 probable kills, and 7 damaged. Additional confirmation would come later from gun camera footage and from captured German records. But the numbers, as impressive as they were, couldn't capture the complete transformation that had occurred. The bomber crews who landed safely in Italy that evening would spread the word through every airbase in the theater. The Red Tails hadn't just protected them, they had dominated the sky. Within days, bomber crews were specifically requesting Tuskegee escorts for their missions. The German response was documented in interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe pilots over the following weeks. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, shot down over Austria on March 28 and interrogated by Allied intelligence on March 30, provided testimony that was typical. "We were told the colored pilots were inferior, poorly trained, easy targets." This was a lie that cost many lives. The red-tailed fighters fought with precision and courage we had not expected. After March 24, we were ordered to avoid engagement with them when possible. The mockery had transformed into respect earned through the most demanding crucible imaginable, air combat at 400 miles per hour, where mistakes are measured in fractions of seconds and paid for with lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The victory of March 24, 1945, reverberated through the highest levels of Allied command. Within 48 hours, General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, requested a full briefing on the Tuskegee Airmen's tactics and performance. According to declassified Strategic Air Forces records dated March 27, 1945, Spaatz wrote to General Ira Eaker, "The 332nd Fighter Group's performance over Berlin represents the most effective escort operation of this theater. Their zero-loss record for protected bombers is unprecedented. We must analyze their methods for application across all fighter groups." The statistical evidence was overwhelming. Between June 1944 and March 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group had flown 311 combat missions escorting heavy bombers. According to 15th Air Force operational records, bombers under their protection experienced the lowest loss rate of any escorted formations in the entire European theater, less than 1% compared to the theater average of 3.7%. The myth that black pilots were inferior had been demolished not through arguments or appeals to equality, but through measurable, documented combat superiority. The March 24 mission became a turning point in multiple dimensions. Militarily, it demonstrated that properly trained pilots using superior tactics could overcome technological advantages. The Me-262, which had terrorized Allied bomber formations for months, had been proven vulnerable to disciplined, aggressive fighter tactics. Within weeks, all fighter groups in the theater received tactical briefings based on the Tuskegee Airmen's methods for countering jet fighters. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was equally significant. German military records from April 1945, examined by historians after the war, show that Me-262 units began refusing missions when intelligence indicated red-tailed fighters would be present. One report from Jageschwader 7, dated April 3, 1945, stated, "Pilot morale has deteriorated following encounters with colored American fighter group. Request reassignment to sectors where these units are not operational." The irony was profound. The Nazi ideology of racial superiority had collided with objective reality at 25,000 feet over Berlin, and reality had won decisively. The Luftwaffe pilots, indoctrinated to believe in Aryan supremacy, found themselves outfought, outmaneuvered, and psychologically dominated by the very men their ideology claimed were inferior. Back at Ramitelli, the Tuskegee Airmen processed their victory with characteristic professionalism. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, in his personal diary entry from March 25, wrote, "Today's mission proves what we have always known, that capability has nothing to do with skin color. We did not fight to prove ourselves to those who doubted us. We fought to protect the men in those bombers, to complete our mission, and to honor the uniform we wear. The victory belongs to every man who refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on us." The bomber crews, however, were less restrained in their appreciation. On March 26, crews from the 2nd Bomb Group presented the 332nd Fighter Group with a hand-painted banner reading, "By the grace of God and the skills of the Red Tails, we are alive." The banner, now preserved at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, was signed by 127 bomber crewmen who had flown the Berlin mission. The press coverage that followed the mission began to shift American public perception. While official military policy still enforced segregation, newspaper accounts from late March 1945 began questioning the logic of discriminating against pilots who were demonstrably among the best in the air forces. The Chicago Defender, one of the nation's leading black newspapers, published a front-page story on March 29 with the headline, "Red Tail Angels Dominate Berlin Skies. Nazi Jets No Match for Tuskegee Precision." White newspapers, previously reluctant to cover the achievements of black military units, began carrying stories as well. The New York Times, on March 30, 1945, published a detailed account titled "Negro Pilots Excel in Berlin Raid," marking one of the first times a major mainstream newspaper had prominently featured the accomplishments of black combat pilots. The men who had been mocked by German pilots just days earlier were now being celebrated as heroes, not because of their race, but because of their undeniable excellence. The transformation was not complete, and discrimination would persist for years to come, but the foundation had shifted. Excellence, documented and irrefutable, had created cracks in the edifice of prejudice. The final statistics from the March 24 mission were confirmed through multiple sources over the following weeks. Gun camera footage, analyzed by intelligence specialists, verified 12 Me-262 kills attributed to the 332nd Fighter Group. Captured German loss records, obtained after the war ended, confirmed an additional 3 Me-262s destroyed that day that had not been claimed by American pilots, aircraft that had been so severely damaged they crashed attempting to return to base. The total count reached 15 jet fighters destroyed in a single mission, the highest one-day total for any Allied fighter group during the entire war. But the numbers told only part of the story. The Tuskegee Airmen's combat record extended far beyond March 24. According to official Air Force historical records, the 332nd Fighter Group flew a total of 1,578 combat missions and 15,533 combat sorties during the war. Their pilots destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, damaged 150 more, and destroyed or damaged over 1,000 ground targets including locomotives, motor vehicles, and enemy installations. The distinction that defined their legacy, however, was the bomber protection record. Of the hundreds of escort missions they flew, bomber losses while under direct protection of the red-tailed fighters remained extraordinarily low. While no fighter group could guarantee zero losses on every mission, the chaos of combat made that impossible. The 332nd's protection record was statistically superior to all other groups in the theater. This achievement came at a cost. The 332nd Fighter Group lost 66 pilots killed in action during the war. Each name is now inscribed on memorials at Tuskegee University and the National Museum of the United States Air Force. They died fighting two wars simultaneously, one against fascism abroad, another against racism at home. Captain Jerome Thompson, who had meticulously compiled the intelligence reports that enabled the March 24 tactical victory, was killed on April 15, 1945, when his P-51 was hit by anti-aircraft fire over Austria. He was 26 years old. Lieutenant Charles Foster, who had destroyed an Me-262 in the early minutes of the Berlin Battle, died on April 26 when his aircraft suffered engine failure on takeoff. He was 23. Their sacrifices, and those of their comrades, eventually helped dismantle the institutional racism that had nearly prevented the Tuskegee experiment from happening at all. The combat record was too exceptional to ignore, the evidence too overwhelming to dismiss. On July 26, 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of the United States Armed Forces. While Truman's decision was influenced by multiple factors including political considerations and Cold War pressures, historians consistently cite the Tuskegee Airmen's combat record as crucial evidence that racial segregation in the military was both unjust and tactically counterproductive. How could the military justify separating pilots by race when the segregated black unit had outperformed their white counterparts? Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had commanded the 332nd Fighter Group throughout their combat operations, went on to become the first black general in the United States Air Force in 1954. In 1998, he was advanced to 4-star general by President Bill Clinton. In his autobiography, published in 1991, Davis reflected on the March 24 mission. "We knew that day that we had accomplished something extraordinary. But we also knew our fight was larger than any single battle. We were fighting for the right of all Americans to serve their country based on their abilities, not their skin color." The red tails were not just aircraft markings, they were symbols of excellence that prejudice could not erase. The physical evidence of that excellence remained visible for years. Several of the red-tailed P-51 Mustangs flown on the Berlin mission survived the war. One aircraft, tail number 44 to 14798, flown by Lieutenant Andrew Patterson on March 24, was eventually restored and is now displayed at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Visitors can still see the red tail that once terrorized the Luftwaffe and the 6 small swastika kill markings beneath the cockpit. Patterson's confirmed victories, 3 of them Me-262s. The bullets' holes from anti-aircraft fire were deliberately left unrepaired during restoration, scars that tell their own story of courage under fire. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen and their March 24, 1945 victory over Berlin represents more than a military achievement, it represents the triumph of human potential over systematic oppression. These men had been told by their own country that they were unsuited for combat aviation. They had been segregated, doubted, and denied opportunities given freely to white pilots. Yet when given the chance to prove themselves, they didn't just succeed, they excelled. The German pilots who mocked the red-tailed fighters learned a lesson that cost many of them their lives. Prejudice is not just morally wrong, it's tactically stupid. Underestimating an opponent because of their race or background is a fatal error in any contest, but especially in combat where mistakes are permanent. The Luftwaffe's assumption of superiority based on Nazi racial ideology collided with the reality of Tuskegee precision at 25,000 feet, and ideology lost decisively. The final accounting of the Tuskegee Airmen's service reveals the magnitude of their contribution. During World War II, 992 pilots graduated from the Tuskegee Army Airfield Program. Of these, 450 deployed overseas for combat duty. They flew 1,578 missions, destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, and earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, and 8 Purple Hearts. 3 Tuskegee Airmen received the Medal of Honor, though these awards came decades after the war, a delay that itself speaks to the persistent discrimination they faced. But statistics cannot capture the human dimension of their achievement. Each mission represented men who had to be twice as good to be considered half as capable. Every flight was conducted under the knowledge that failure would be attributed to their race rather than individual circumstances, while success would be dismissed as an exception. The psychological burden of representing an entire race in combat, while simultaneously fighting for survival against enemy aircraft, is difficult for those who haven't experienced it to fully comprehend. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, who led the 100th Fighter Squadron on March 24, survived the war and lived until 2005. In his final interview, recorded for the Veterans History Project in 2004, he reflected on that day over Berlin. "People ask me if we thought about history while we were fighting. The answer is no. We thought about keeping our bomber crews alive and getting our own pilots home safely. We thought about executing our tactics perfectly because imperfection meant death. The history part, that came later. But I'll tell you what I remember most clearly from that day. It was the radio transmission after we'd fought off the last German attack. A bomber pilot, I never learned his name, transmitted, 'Thank you, Red Tails. You saved our lives today.' And I remember thinking, this is why we're here. Not to prove anything to anyone, but to do our job so well that it becomes impossible to deny us." That denial became impossible after March 24, 1945. The evidence was too clear, the documentation too thorough, the achievement too exceptional. The German pilots who survived encounters with the red-tailed fighters carried those memories for the rest of their lives. In post-war interviews, many expressed regret not just for serving the Nazi regime, but for having believed its racial lies. One German veteran, speaking in 1985 at a reunion that brought together former enemies, stated, "We were taught that some races were superior to others. Then the black American pilots taught us a different lesson. They taught us that courage and skill have no color. It was a lesson paid for in blood, much of it German blood." The caves beneath Iwo Jima, scorched by flamethrower tanks, and the skies above Berlin, cleared by red-tailed fighters, tell complementary stories of how America won World War II. Superior technology mattered. Industrial capacity mattered. But most of all, the willingness to let capable Americans serve regardless of their background, that mattered most. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that diversity isn't just a moral imperative, it's a tactical advantage. Every talented pilot denied the opportunity to serve because of race was a wasted resource. Every excellent officer held back by discrimination was a failure of military efficiency. The Red Tails demonstrated that excellence has no color, and that prejudice is not just evil, it's expensive, inefficient, and ultimately self-defeating. Today, the United States Air Force is integrated. Pilots of all races fly the most advanced aircraft in the world. The idea of segregating them by race seems as absurd as it actually always was. But this progress was not inevitable, it was fought for by men who had to prove their excellence under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The final mission statistics from March 24, 1945 remain in the official records: 15 Mi-262s destroyed, 0 bombers lost under escort, 62 red-tailed fighters returned safely. But the true victory wasn't measured in aircraft destroyed or missions completed. The true victory was the systematic demolition of the lie that some Americans were less capable than others because of their skin color. The German pilots who mocked the red-tailed fighters on that March morning learned that mockery is a poor defense against .50 caliber machine guns fired by pilots who are better trained, better led, and absolutely determined to prove that excellence cannot be segregated. They learned it at 400 miles per hour, 25,000 feet above Berlin, from pilots they should have respected from the beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.